So welcome to the second webinar of the Climate Finance ICCG webinar series. Today's webinar is on building a sustainable financial system from design to delivery, and will be given by Nick Robbins, who is co-director of the UNEP Inquiry initiative. Today's webinar will focus on how harnessing $300 trillion in the global financial system that will be essential to make a successful transition to a prosperous and low-carbon economy. So UNEP Inquiry has uncovered a quiet revolution in policy and market innovations to mobilize capital and mainstream sustainability factors in banking, capital markets, insurance, and investment. This webinar will present the findings of its global report, The Financial System We Need, and outline opportunities in 2016, including in Italy. So our speaker, Nick Robbins, is co-director of UNEP Inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system, which is an international initiative to advance financial policy options that more effectively mobilize capital for an inclusive green economy. So Nick Robbins has over 20 years experience in the policy, research and financial dimensions of sustainable development. And before joining UNEP, he was head of the Climate Change Center of Excellence at the HSBC in London from 2007 to 2014, where he produced investment research on issues such as clean tech growth, climate vulnerability, green stimulus and stranded assets. In the Thomson Reuters Extel Awards for European Investment Research, Nick Robbins was ranked as #1 analyst for integrated climate change for 4 years, of which 3 in a row. So prior to HSBC, Nick was first head of sustainable and responsible investment research and then head of 3 funds at Henderson Global Investors. At Henderson, he published the first ever carbon audit of an investment fund and co-designed the Industries of the Future Fund. Nick has also worked for International Institute of Environment and Development and the European Commission's Environment Directorate, and was part of the original Business Council for Sustainable Development, working on the Changing Course book for the 1992 Health Summit. So now I leave the floor to you, Nick, for your speech, and then there will be a Q&A session of 20 minutes where all of you are very welcome to ask questions through the GoToWebinar system. So please, Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabella. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining this webinar. I really am very grateful to FEAM and ICCG for hosting this ability to discuss with you some of the emerging findings of the inquiry into a sustainable financial system and really identify some of the real opportunities we have for mobilizing financial assets within the financial system for climate action and sustainable development. As Isabella said, I have a sort of financial background, and the reason I joined UNEP in 2014 to work on the inquiry was a recognition that increasingly, as well as having policies within the real economy, carbon pricing, renewables policy, energy policy, use of public finance and so on, we also need to think more hard about what we need to do within the financial system itself. So that's why I joined UNEP, and it's been a great journey so far. So really, I think what I'd like to leave with you are these sort of 3 key points from our work since 2014. And really, I think the first is a sense that last year was, I think, the year that sustainability became recognized as a key factor for overall financial system health. I think that can be seen at the national level, but also at the international level, for example, actions by the Financial Stability Board. Our work was to look at policy options for financial policymakers and regulators, what they could do to better integrate sustainable development. And we were, I think, quite surprised to find quite a sort of quiet revolution in policy and practice, a number of innovations across banking, capital markets, insurance, and investment. This is still largely largely very new and quite fragmented, so there's still a lot to do. This is still a very early stage process. This year, I think, has already started with a lot of momentum, and I think a growing recognition that work within the financial system is going to be critical if we're going to rapidly implement the Paris Agreement and also the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think a number of countries, and I'll discuss these, are thinking about sort of green finance strategies to help them deliver the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So the challenge before us, as we know, we have too much finance undermining natural capital and too little capital that is actually restoring natural capital and delivering long-term sustainable development. The sums involved are very large and measured in trillions. Estimates suggest about 5 to 7 trillion is needed each year in capital investment for the Sustainable Development Goals. As we know, the financial system has not been traditionally aligned to long-term sustainable development, and then Pope Francis, in his encyclical last year, highlighted some of the tensions there. As the quote suggests, finance overwhelms the real economy. The lessons of the global financial crisis have not been assimilated, and we're learning all too slowly the lessons of environmental deterioration. That's the challenge. For us, I think the question was, when we're looking at the overall financial system, we're talking about a system which has assets of around 300 trillion, mostly in the banking sector. We also have capital markets, about 100 trillion in bonds, around 70 trillion in equities. Institutional investors of various sorts have around 100 trillion, and insurance obviously has assets. About 30 trillion obviously insures through its products many multiples of that. When we've been thinking about how we mobilize capital for sustainable development and climate action, generally we've been focusing quite understandably on real economy action. If there are externalities, let's fix the externalities. Let's have proper pricing and proper regulation. And also we will need to supplement that with public spending, particularly to ensure that public goods are delivered, and also potentially to help crowd in private capital. But I think there's been growing recognition that these two strategies are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. And we also need to look at action within the financial system itself. And in the work we've been doing, we've identified potentially 4 reasons why you might want to be looking at action within the financial system to complement those 2 core strategies of real economy policy and also public finance. First is clearly risk management. Inadequate risk management within the financial system might exacerbate some of the environmental and social challenges we face. Secondly is promoting innovation. We're going to need a lot of financial innovation to actually deliver the flows of capital we require, and sometimes existing capital markets can have blockages or obstacles to that innovation. Thirdly, increasingly we're going to need to actually strengthen resilience of the financial system to shocks created by environmental degradation. And finally, obviously, we want to ensure policy coherence, that the regulations and rules that govern the financial system are lined up and are positively lined up with goals for sustainable development. And that's not always the case. So our mandate, set up by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, by our Executive Director Achim Steiner, with an International Advisory Council, was to advance policy options which could improve the financial system's alignment with sustainable development. We took a 2-year process and published our findings last October 2015. We developed a framework for analysis, looked at findings. We've got a toolkit of options which we developed, suggested a framework of action, and now we're going through the process of taking forward the recommendations that we came up with. Importantly, we focused on what is actually happening in countries, and this was a short-term exercise, less than 2 years, so we couldn't look all around the world, but we tried to focus on a range of different countries, different stages of development, with different financial systems, and also working with different partners. So, for example, in some countries, such as China and also Bangladesh and the UK, working with central banks obviously play a pivotal role. In other countries, working with private sector organizations, so in India, in Kenya, and in Brazil. In some cases, we're working with leading financial institutions themselves, in Switzerland with Swiss Re, and in the US with CalPERS, the pension fund, and a number of think tanks and NGOs also that we've been working with, to get a sort of a diversity of perspectives on how issues of sustainable development are already impinging on the rules of the government financial system, and what needs to be done next. So this is really our family photo. This is a picture of the launch of the inquiry's findings, the financial system we need, last October in Lima, Peru, and at the occasion of the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. So this is the major gathering of financial ministers and central bank governors from around the world. And this was really the first time that there had been a focused event looking at actually how the policies and the regulations and the standards that these senior policymakers set, how are those aligned with sustainable development. 4 people on the panel, on the right, my executive director, Achim Steiner from UNEP, next to him, the then governor of the Bangladesh Bank, the Central Bank of Bangladesh, next to him Yi Gang, deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, and then Mark Carney on the left, governor of the Bank of England, also the current chair of the Financial Stability Board. I think what is very striking about the launch is here you have 3 people coming from very different starting points, a developing country, an emerging economy, and an industrialized economy, all realizing from different perspectives, different starting points, that actually considerations around climate, considerations around sustainability were now part of their core mandate to help promote financial stability and also underpin long-term economic development of the countries that they operate in. For Mark Carney, one of the keys is that green finance, which is now growing but still very small, cannot remain a niche. We need to think about strategies for mainstreaming. For Atiyah Rahman, really thinking through how we can actually incorporate issues around sustainable finance into the fundamental development process and the ways that central and financial stability policy. For Yi Gang, talking a lot about China's green finance activities domestically, but also, I think, a surprise to many in the room, the announcement that China will make green finance a priority of its presidency of the G20 in 2016, this year. And that's a commitment that China has carried out in a new green finance study group, really looking at how the financial system activities can be better aligned with long-term green investment. Broad concepts of green finance, not just climate, but broad environmental imperatives. So that was really the result and the launch. In terms of our findings, as Isabella suggested at the beginning, we found what we called a quiet revolution, perhaps much more going on than we thought. In many cases, often led by developing and emerging economies, perhaps by the fact that these economies are facing the toughest environmental challenges, and responses to these challenges are most clearly aligned with those countries' long-term economic development strategies. Very different starting points. Bangladesh starting with financial inclusion, moving into green finance. China, we'll go into more detail, very much response to the air pollution and other pollution crises that the country has been facing. In India, not so much a risk approach, very much coming from a need to really scale up infrastructure investment in terms of energy, in terms of cities, in terms of water. In the Netherlands, in Europe, actually the response has come out of actually rebuilding confidence and trust in the financial system after the 2008 global crisis. The UK, very much a response to the risks around climate change. A whole range of different measures we saw as well in Brazil, integrating environmental social risk into prudential banking regulation. France, new world-leading requirements on investors to report on climate alignment. Indonesia, the world's first roadmap on sustainable finance delivered by the financial regulator, OJK. In South Africa, many innovations, but one updating pension regulations to show that actually incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors are part of modern fiduciary duty. And in the US, a lot of action at the state level, but at the federal level also incentives for clean energy bonds. Many of these initiatives are driven by local, national priorities. There's no real coordination as yet, and so often these things are quite fragmented. We try to cluster them into 4 or 5 main areas. First, what can policymakers do to actually enhance the way markets operate, disclosure rules and so on? How can they better use the public balance sheet in terms of actually encouraging deployment of private capital. In cases where actually what do policymakers and regulators need to do to direct finance more clearly around sustainable development, something is often used in developing countries. How do we think about culture? The culture, the norms, the practices, the skills that we need to have for the transition. And finally, how do we think about governance as a whole? The governance, obviously, of financial institutions, but also the mandates of major institutions such as central banks. I'd like to go through a few examples to give you a flavor of what's going on. And I'll start with three emerging economies and then go on to three industrialized economies. Brazil really facing tough times now, but I think if we look back and where some of the innovation has come from in sustainable finance, Brazil is often a leader, not just in its stock market, Bovespa, but also in the way that its central bank has started to make environmental and social factors a mainstream risk factor in prudential regulation in 2014. The first central banks really to incorporate environmental factors into the implementation of the Basel III norms. Interestingly, working with our partner FEBRABAN, the Brazilian Bankers Association, the first attempt from the private sector to actually start measuring flows of green finance. We talk a lot about sustainable finance, a lot about green finance, but the basic data sets are still very poor. We don't know how much green finance there is. In Brazil, the first estimates was around 9%. Now, Brazil, obviously, a lot of its prosperity and development is based on its key position as a leading agricultural nation, and therefore I think the quote at the bottom there from Aleosio to the number sort of is in a sense a statement of an obvious fact that sustainability is a positive asset for financial monetary stability when Brazil comes to think of these issues. Next, turning to China, we've mentioned a couple of times already, completely different situation, very clearly being driven by a response to the country's environmental problems and crises. Estimates of upwards of $400 billion a year needed in green investment for remediation, for cleaner energy, for transport, waste, and so on, and a recognition that only 15% of that can come from the public budget. So the rest has to be found from private sources, and a recognition that to do that, there'll need to be really a green financial system. So the inquiry was delighted to work with the People's Bank of China on a green finance task force to identify measures which could help close that gap. 14 specific recommendations, very much focusing on harnessing capital markets around green bonds, green ratings, lender liability of banks to polluting industries, environmental insurance, and stock market disclosure. Very interestingly, these have been integrated into the current 5-year plan and also have been pushed through into actual measures. So new green bond norms have been developed by the People's Bank of China and other regulators. And this year, China's issuance of green bonds is about half of global issuance, which really shows these deliberative processes can have quite an impact in terms of actual financial flows. And as I say, China has now taken this from the domestic level and proposed that a green finance task force be established at the international level, which is now being co-chaired with the UK, and the UNEP Inquiry has been asked to be the secretariat for that. So it's now a global debate, not just a domestic debate. India, the occasion latest country report in partnership with FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Again, a focus very much on infrastructure needs, not so much responding to pollution issues, but really responding to the huge growth needs of that country in terms of meeting unmet needs for energy, for housing, for water. And about 200 billion a year needed just in basic infrastructure. Some measures already starting to be taken place. India has a very specific set of requirements for banks. 40% of bank lending has to be allocated to so-called priority sectors, agriculture and so on. And last year the central bank decided that actually social infrastructure and also decentralized renewables could be included as part of that. So again, a way of channeling private capital towards sustainability ends. Also increasing private sector leadership. The Indian Bankers Association have established their own responsible finance guidelines, and interestingly the securities regulator SEBI this January launched again its requirements for the green bonds market, both to ensure market integrity, that actually there wasn't going to be mis-selling, but also to ensure that actually Mumbai and other financial centres in India also had a stake in the growth of this green bond market. And again, from my meetings with companies and banks last week in India, I think we can expect a substantial increase in green bond issuance this year. Interestingly, the Finance Ministry, and notably Jayant Sinha, the Minister of State for Finance, is very aware of these issues, also Piyush Goyal, the Minister of Power and Coal and Renewables. And it was interesting when the report was launched that Mr. Sinha also highlighted his support for the call for an overall green finance strategy to bring some of these emerging themes together. Turning to Europe, if I may, looking at a number of countries and again showing some of the different drivers and also the different measures and policies that countries are taking. France, not only the very successful president of the COP in Paris last year, but also very interestingly pushing forward measures at the domestic level to harness its own domestic financial system for the transition. The Energy Transition Law agreed last year, having some of the probably the most advanced measures to encourage and require better reporting from investors on how they are aligned with the 2-degree pathway and the risks they are facing, and also a signal, a placeholder that banks will need to start incorporating climate factors into stress tests, and a public report will be on that later this year. Interestingly, this sort of fits on a number of other policy measures that have been taken, tax incentives in terms of savings for households to help channel savings into sustainable ends, and also product labeling, again important so that consumers can actually start choosing where they place their savings in terms of investment products. I think Laurent Fabius, the chair of COP, and until recently the Foreign Minister, very clear that as part of his vision for the Paris outcome, which I think came to pass, that the financial system as a whole needs to take climate risk into account, anticipating government targets and integrating this into investment decisions. And France, I think, very much a leader in terms of encouraging the Financial Stability Board to pick up climate change now being launched being realised through this task force on climate disclosure. Turning to the UK, again, often a leader in much of the sustainability arena over a number of years. Recent activities have focused on fiduciary duty, the obligation of investors when managing other people's money to take account of material risk factors and material opportunities, and now a clarification that this should now really include sustainability factors. The Bank of England, I think, has been recognised as being, again, one of the leaders in terms of central banks looking at sustainability factors, particularly climate risks. The Prudential Regulatory Authority last September published a report looking at how climate risk could affect the safety and soundness of the insurance sector, identifying physical risks from disruptions to the climate system, transition risks, particularly in terms of high carbon assets, and also potentially litigation risks in the same way we had litigation challenges around asbestos from insurers. And I think this analytical work they did, again, enabled the Bank of England and Mark Carney, when the French made the request, the FSB look at climate risk, to actually move forward because the analytical basis that this was a material challenge had been made. Important as well to add that actually this is not just a trend involving policy action, but also, I think, bottom-up action from financial sector itself. And earlier this year we were delighted to launch with the City of London our report on the UK, which is the occasion for the Corporation of London, which is in charge of promoting London as a financial centre. The launch of their Green Finance Initiative, really seeing how green finance could be part of the competitive profile of London as a centre. Mark Carney, I think, is now well known for his focus on the long-term nature of climate challenges and has coined this phrase, the tragedy of horizon, that obviously many of the challenges we faced in the sustainable development arena are long-term, and it's not just markets which have a short-term horizon, but often policymakers do as well. So we need to sort of rethink how these long-term challenges, which often are discounted away in financial analysis, how they can become material before it's too late. I'd just like to touch on the European Union itself. Again, Europe has been probably the center of developments in terms of sustainable finance, the largest sort of stock of assets managed on a responsible investment basis, banks leading on the Equator Principles, etc. And really in the last year or so, I think we've seen a take-up increasingly by the sort of financial policy community within the European Union of sustainability as a strategic theme. We have the Capital Markets Union aiming to increase access to capital, particularly for small businesses and also for infrastructure. And again, for the first time, recognizing that sustainability was an important part of capital markets, particularly around green bonds, amendments to pensions regulation at the European level, efforts to improve corporate disclosure, reporting directive, and the European Systemic Risk Board, its academic panel, has published a first review looking at the risks around carbon and stranded assets and the risks they may pose for the financial system as a whole. Very interestingly, on April 22nd, the same day that the Paris Agreement, we had the signing ceremony in New York, the ECOFIN, the meeting of finance ministers of the European Union, for the first time at an informal meeting in Amsterdam under the Dutch presidency, discussed issues about what is their role as finance ministers to really take account of sustainability both as a risk factor in terms of climate change, but also in terms of an opportunity factor for mobilizing capital for long-term green infrastructure. So that's, I think, that's what we found. I think a growing sense of the need for complementary action within the financial system. Here is a list of the 10 recommendations we made in our report, and I urge you to look at the report, Financial System We Need, which is available in all UN languages on the website, and just a set of recommendations to take forward this agenda. The idea that potentially we need a set of principles about what a sustainable financial system could be. Convergence on disclosure standards, very much something picked up in the FSB task force. Measures to optimize use of fiscal incentives in the financial system. A performance framework to know whether we're going forwards or back. Work to integrate environmental factors and social factors into banking standards, such as Basel. Making progress in terms of clarifying at the international level that fiduciary and other duties now do include sustainability factors. A new coalition for greening capital markets, and we're delighted to be a partner of the new Green Infrastructure Investment Coalition with the Climate Bonds Initiative and also the PRI to really bring together investors who want to deploy capital towards green infrastructure. Guidance for insurance regulators, and we're working with a number of insurance regulators to set up what's been called the Sustainable Insurance Policy Forum to see how sustainability factors can be better managed within their mandates. And finally, as always, more research required, new methodologies, new approaches to understanding how these various factors interact, and more research required there. Now, if we move to 2016, this year, I think it's been a very dynamic year, and I think for us, very clearly a recognition that as we think about implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, clearly action within the financial system will be important for that. Perhaps on sort of two main axes. Firstly, in terms of mobilizing capital, deploying capital for particular priorities, particularly in terms of financial inclusion, obviously in developing countries, but also improving access to finance for low-income households in developed countries and also for small and medium-sized enterprises, which often face difficulties getting access to capital. Infrastructure, clearly an absolute priority. If we get it wrong, that will lock in carbon emissions and risks in terms of depletion of natural capital. Around 90 trillion will be spent over the next 15 years. Green infrastructure, a real priority. And also quite different, actually, how do we better use financial system assets for financing innovation, the new technologies we'll need to make breakthrough advances. Then, of course, there's the whole issue of mainstreaming sustainability factors across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in terms of market integrity, issues around corruption and tax and illicit finance, and also making sure that markets respect fundamental human rights. I talked already about issues about risk and resilience, clearly a major priority to improve the capacity to measure and manage risk, and then finally issues around the responsibility of financial institutions, particularly the fiduciary duty issue. One issue I think I've mentioned a number of times during this presentation, I think is really the indicator species for green finance moment is the area of green bonds, a rapid growth from 2012 to 2015, and really expectations perhaps are about issuance of $100 billion this year. As I've suggested as we've gone along, what is interesting is we not just only have sort of private sector action, green bond principles, also sort of collaborative standards being developed by the Climate Bonds Initiative, and also policy action, notably in China and India, and I think other countries will follow. So I think we're getting the sort of framework in place for a considerable scaling up. And a number of major issuances this in the first months of this year from sort of companies such as Apple, but also major institutions in China, Shanghai and Pudong Development Bank. The great thing about green bonds is the simplicity. That these are well-known instruments, and the key, once we have good, trusted rules in place to ensure market integrity, this provides a very important signaling device for investors who want to invest in green assets and for issuers who want to raise capital. So, just a few more slides, if I may, before I sort of answer your questions. This year, I think we're seeing as the sort of the year of green finance. There are many sort of phrases that are used in this arena. This is the phrase that's been used in the context of the Green Finance Study Group set up, as I mentioned, by China. And so I think one of the key themes this year is really thinking about how do we strengthen the international market architecture, how do we improve cooperation between countries, and I think that will be a real focus this year at the summit in September, to look at the results of the Green Finance Study Group to see how we've come through in terms of the key areas for cooperation between these major economies. Second is then thinking about how we mobilize better institutional investors, a key focus after the financial crisis with much greater pressure on bank balance sheets. As I mentioned earlier, the Green Infrastructure Investment Coalition is a group of investors, insurance companies, and also increasingly countries who want to actually have a way of selling green assets into the institutional investor community. That has started very positively, particularly with Brazil, India, and also with Mexico. Also, questions about how we build resilience. The Sustainable Insurance Policy Forum has been launched. We've got a leadership coalition of insurance supervisors from California, from Brazil, from the UK, from the Netherlands, from France, from the Philippines, who all want to work together to share best practice and develop common approaches to how we incorporate sustainability factors into their mandates. Transparency, a key issue. It's great to see the Financial Stability Board's task force moving very quickly this year with a fantastic first report and consultation on that report out last month, and the consultation period has now been extended to the end of this month, so please I'd urge you to make your submissions into that process. And finally, as I mentioned, this focus of making it real at the national level. In the case of India, interestingly, the Minister of State of Finance there, Jayant Sinha, seeing, I think, some of the innovation on green bonds and other areas, but saying, well, really, it would be useful to have an overall green finance strategy for the country. And I think that's what we're going to see more of as countries try and think about a comprehensive approach to this issue. One of those, I think, is Italy. We're delighted to be a partner with the Ministry of Environment in Italy, MATAM, who earlier this year launched a national dialogue on sustainable finance to identify key policy market options for mobilizing the financial system in Italy for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also for climate action. This slide hopefully gives you a sense of the framework that is being taken forward by the dialogue, which is involving major public institutions, private sector bodies, but also think tanks and research institutions and NGOs, really thinking about the actions, the motivations for action in terms of the real economy, in terms of environmental threats, demand from markets and also social expectations, and then these two interconnecting priorities, firstly of mobilizing capital and secondly of mainstreaming, and really thinking through what this might mean for the key sectors of the Italian financial sector, banking, capital markets, investors and insurance. And then in all of this, really thinking about how we can measure progress both at the portfolio level, within institutions, at the institutional level, and then at the market and the system level. So that's a process just started, and hopefully the first results will be out at the end of this year. So I'd like to conclude, if I may, taking the words of my Executive Director, Achim Steiner, at the bottom of this slide, that if we saw 2015 as the year of building new foundations for the global economy and signaling new directions, this year, 2016, is to take practical steps forward. The inquiry has been extended following our initial work, gathering the evidence, making the case, and focusing on sort of these three main pillars of work. Firstly, supporting and working with emerging leaders, some of the countries already working with, newer countries, as I mentioned, with Italy, country engagement, engagement with market leaders, and particularly focusing on developing countries. Then clearly international collaboration, G20 I've mentioned, Green Finance Study Group, and working with a number of the major financial institutions, FSB, IMF, OECD, World Bank. And then really thinking through some of the sort of system level innovations and analytics, one of these being fintech, financial technology. How does the rapid disruptive power of digitization, how is that linked positively or negatively with sustainable development? Going into more depth about how we measure the performance of the financial system in terms of flows of finance, in terms of performance, in terms of governance, and as I say, working with regulators, particularly in the insurance sector, to think through how their policies can be better aligned. That's really the end of the presentation phase. Just like to, if I may, direct you to the website where we have about now 70 reports, the overall inquiry report, plus a whole set of country reports and thematic reports and so on. And I hope you would find that answers many of your questions and encourages you to think more about how the financial system in your country can be better aligned with sustainable development. So thank you very much. Back to you, Isabella, and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this insightful and comprehensive presentation. Now I would like to start with a few questions my own, and then we'll go through the questions that are arriving. So what was the most surprising thing that you found in the inquiry report? I mean, if you should, point out to some special result.
Well, I think perhaps one of the things is the speed of this agenda. I think that's the most surprising thing, is actually how rapidly things moved over the 2014-2015 period. So, for example, in China, as I mentioned, developing this green finance strategy, now incorporated into the national plan, work at the Bank of England. Again, just to highlight, really last January when I first went to see the Financial Stability Board, there were no plans whatsoever to think about environmental or climate issues. Now we have an international task force on climate disclosure. So I think that was perhaps the most surprising thing, that actually this agenda is moving very, very quickly, and therefore there's a lot of potential, I think, looking forward.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question that is linked to, for me, is a very important thing. It's the Basel III, the third Basel Accord, the global voluntary regulatory framework for bank capital adequacy and the market liquidity risk. So the question is, to the best of your knowledge, Basel III doesn't take into account environmental risks as well as issues such as green and sustainable financing. Do you believe that it should?
Mm-hmm. I think no, it's a good question, and our colleagues at UNEP Finance Initiative actually produced a very good paper on this, written by Professor Kern Alexander from Zurich University, working with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I think what we've seen is that there are actually the Basel framework is fairly flexible. It does allow national regulators to incorporate material factors, as I mentioned, as Brazil has done. And they have made the incorporation of environmental social factors a core part of sort of overall risk governance. However, I think because it isn't explicit within the Basel framework, there is a sense of caution, perhaps, on a number of banking regulators. So I think it is an area to explore further how the regulators that meet under the Basel framework can potentially sort of share experience about banking regulation and sustainability factors. And there are increasing numbers of largely emerging economies who are working together through an initiative called the Sustainable Banking Network, and as I mentioned with France, also starting to think through how environmental and climate factors need to be incorporated into stress tests. So I think it's an area of quite a lot of sensitivity. I think the banking regulators want to make sure that their primary focus on safety and soundness, a prudential approach, is maintained. But I think the evidence is mounting that environmental factors can pose real material risks for bank assets and banking institutions. So I think that this will be an area where there'll be more focus in the future.
Thank you. Another question is, the Financial Stability Board is developing climate change-related disclosure needs, physical risks as part of it, but there is still few developings in this field. Where do you see this work will be further being developed?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting initiative. As I mentioned, the FSB has moved from doing almost nothing, well, in fact nothing on environmental issues, to now having this task force. What I think is important to recognize that this, maybe two or three things about this. Firstly, actually there's been a lot of often voluntary initiatives to improve disclosure from corporations over the last 10-15 years. In many countries this is increasingly regulated, and I think also, as I suggested with the French case, increasing focus also on financial institutions reporting on their climate and sustainability performance. So I think that's the sort of, that in a sense is the first thing, that actually the FSB initiative on climate disclosure comes at a time where we already have some of the building blocks in place, but it's certainly not consistent. Disclosure is by no means universal, and also it's not being incorporated into the ways that analysts and credit rating agencies fundamentally price financial assets. So I think that's we've got a lot of good practice, but I think the focus for this this task force is to come forward with voluntary recommendations for how to move this forward. I think it's very important that this is a global initiative, and there are key emerging and developing country representatives on the FSB task force. As we know, many of the environmental and climate challenges are greatest in these countries, and I think certainly in countries such as Brazil, China and India, you have quite a lot of increasing practice in terms of disclosure. A couple of things perhaps to mention in terms of the climate disclosure, I think things to sort of look out for. really the focus really needs to be not just climate risk, but also sort of climate opportunity and the climate performance of institutions, both corporations and financial institutions. And the second thing is that the disclosure agenda is not just looking at sort of past performance, greenhouse gases last year, but also how businesses and also financial institutions may be affected by climate factors going forward, which is where we come back to this issue of stress tests. But it's an important agenda, as I say. It's moving quite fast. Initial report out and final report out at the end of this year.
Thank you. You mentioned the French energy transition law, which is the only, let's say, binding non-financial disclosure target at the national level in Europe. But now we know that the directive will soon be there, and so what is your flavor in the European countries? So which countries do you think that will comply to the directive first?
Well, I think we're still going through the consultation process for the implementation of the non-financial reporting directive. I must say I hate that phrase, non-financial reporting, because it gives you a sort of sense of a sort of second-class citizen in terms of reporting. And most of what I think people are saying in terms of leading investors and so on is that if it's material, it is financial. So I think some of the phraseology. I think what is interesting is certainly, again, this is part of the rapid evolution of this agenda. I think we're seeing a number of countries coming to this agenda. I think we mentioned already France, we mentioned UK, we mentioned Italy, Sweden, the Netherlands. I think really recognizing this is now a strategy issue. I think one of the things that will be important is not just the development of good guidelines for European Union companies, which obviously include financial institutions, to implement the directive. But also it'd be interesting to see whether there is a group of European countries and perhaps the Union as a whole who can be a leadership group to take forward the recommendations of the FSB task force. So these two things are potentially quite closely linked. The key issue, as we know, is that we need reporting and disclosure to be efficient, very closely focused. We don't want to sort of have huge reporting requirements if it's not needed, and recognizing that actually as we get more scale, more numbers of companies reporting, the costs of reporting come down dramatically. When I did the first carbon footprint investment fund back in 2005, it cost several £1,000s to do that carbon footprint. Now it's effectively free. But this can be done at a terminal with data downloaded from many of the financial data providers. So I think the key for the disclosure agenda, I think, is to get agreement on some of these common factors, to allow flexibility, as the French law does, the comply I will explain, but also I think in some cases have clear requirements for key data points so that stakeholders both in civil society and also in the market can actually do effective comparison. Because without those common indicators, it's very difficult to compare and contrast performance.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very clear answer. Now I have a question. So we know that from $5 to $7 trillion a year is needed for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including for infrastructure, clean energy, water and sanitation, as well as agriculture and, of course, clean energy. So, and we also know that developing countries face annual financial gap, investment gap of around $2.5 trillion, and also that $6 trillion are, let's say, are invested in fossil fuel energy generation. So, and this needs to be scaled back. So, but how do you think, what is the, the financial source, a more reliable financial source or financial instrument that you think that can cope this financial gap? Also, with regard to developing countries.
And this is the key issue, and I think certainly links us to the the Financing for Development agenda agreed last year, and that's really the first of the three major agreements on finance that came out last year, finance and sustainable development. So I think as that Addis Ababa agreement shows us, really the issue is to think about mobilizing public and private capital, particularly for developing countries. Domestically, I think domestic resource mobilization being particularly important, but also international. I think it's important, for example, coming out of Paris, that the 100 billion target in terms of mobilizing financial flows for climate action in developing countries from north to south is now seen as a floor, not a ceiling. And I think there have been some very important commitments made particularly by some of the multilateral development banks in terms of increasing the share of their lending that goes to sort of green finance and climate. I was at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development yesterday, and they're increasing their flows from 25 to 40%. The key for developing countries, and again it's a message coming across very, very strongly, is that they need more finance, particularly more finance from outside, to build up their capital stock, to drive their development, and they need cheaper finance. That particularly the cost of capital, and particularly foreign exchange risk, it can be a real barrier to inflows of capital. So mobilizing domestic capital, that is often capital that can better take some of the local perceived investment risks, mobilizing public capital, making sure that the commitments that industrialized countries made are delivered on, and as I say, I think a number of important commitments have been made. And then thinking through particularly what frameworks need to be in place to attract foreign institutional investors who increasingly have made commitments to green finance and climate and want to see a pipeline of assets, but often are very cautious, particularly around when it comes to currency risk. So those are some of the key priorities, I'd say.
Oh, thank you. We have a question from the auditors. Does UNEP Inquiry work with the UNEP map and the Mediterranean basin? Climate change hotspot is a hotspot but with high potential for climate finance in the Mediterranean.
We haven't as yet. We haven't as yet, and that's a very good suggestion. I mean, there are many great parts of the UNEP family. We've been working very closely, particularly with our green economy colleagues and our colleagues in the finance initiative and some of our regional groups. But I think that would be a very good case. One of the things I think we're seeing after last year is as governments sort of scratch their heads and think through how they're going to really raise the capital for the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, I think we're seeing increasing interest in actually saying, well, how does this agenda fit for me? And I think that would be a good suggestion, so I'll take it up. Thank you.
Great. So another question is how to involve civil society in this process. So we know the Sustainable Development Goal number 17 is calling for a partnership for the goal. So, okay, this is for all the SDGs, but as for the financial sector, so in, comparing to SDG 9, innovation and infrastructure, and SDG 7, renewable energy, so what is the role of civil society for you in this framework, financial framework?
Well, I mean, civil society has been absolutely essential to this. I think if you scratch really almost any initiative on sustainable finance, civil society really is at the root of it. So civil society is important in terms of setting expectations, the expectations of financial institutions in terms of social and environmental performance, expectations of government financial bodies, whether they be regulators, finance ministries, or central banks. And I think in many, if you look back at many initiatives, whether it's the Equator Principles or others, civil society has been an important sort of force in terms of showing why it is important for financial institutions to align themselves with sustainable development. And I think in some of the cases I mentioned, I think the French case is a very interesting one, where it was really the interaction of a number of key stakeholders, financial practitioners who were showing it's possible to actually take a more advanced approach to reporting, civil society organizations such as our partners 2 Degrees Initiative and also the Institute for Climate Economics, really sort of putting, I think, raising the ambition level. So that's the first, that's the first area in terms of, I think, expectations. The second, obviously, is really informing consumers that actually we have billions of financial consumers around the world, whether that's in terms of banking products, savings products, or insurance products. We have still large numbers of people, again billions, who do not have access to the financial products we need. And I think civil society can really play an important role in terms of informing and raising awareness with consumers of how important it is to link their values and their own concerns about Systemland with their financial products. And again, I think that's an area where civil society can be very important, play a very important role in sustainable consumption and production as part of the SDGs. And I think the labelling work that's going ahead in France and the labelling work that's going ahead in Sweden is another important area. And then finally, really, I think it's you set the expectations. I think you help to empower citizens and consumers, and then finally to really holding institutions to account. And I think that will be some of the test of a number of initiatives we've talked about. Again, the importance of disclosure, we talked about a lot in terms of the FSB, is important obviously for financial market performance, but also ensuring accountability. So again, I think that's a key role. And what I think we now have is a whole range of sort of broad-based civil society organizations, but also very specialist sort of market-facing NGOs, such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, the used to be Carbon Disclosure Project, which both, I think, help to raise that ambition, but also can provide that technical competence to both financial institutions and financial policymakers.
Great, thank you. Relating to this issue on disclosure, we have another question. Can you say something more about climate risk disclosure? What kind of incentives are needed to get the asset owners and asset managers on board?
Well, I think that's a very good follow-on question. Here you have the great work of a very dedicated society organization, the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, who recently just published their latest ranking of the world's top 500 asset owners, and it's a very interesting report, and again shows, I think, those roles that civil society can play. Firstly is setting expectations, setting a benchmark about what is good practice in terms of asset owners and climate. Then actually working to raise the awareness of members of pension funds about the risks that they face, and also the opportunities around climate change, and then holding to account and publishing results. So I think the incentives, I think it's both carrot and stick. So I think the carrot is clearly that disclosure by asset owners in particular is wholly consistent with actually being faithful managers of money on behalf of beneficiaries, that actually beneficiaries have a right to know how their money is being managed, so that it's being managed in a properly used and risk-adjusted way, and also meets their concerns. So that's a sort of a first priority, is the alignment of management of pension funds with the fundamental beneficiaries and closing that gap, which is often the case. I think the other, in a sense, incentive is that disclosure can often be seen as a burden by organizations, but actually is a major driver for internal improvement and innovation. And I think that's been the case in the corporate sector and increasingly also in the financial sector. The many financial institutions were initially reluctant to think about carbon footprinting. We now have $10 trillion who are thinking about carbon footprinting. And now moving on to the next phase, which is obviously setting decarbonisation goals. So I think the two incentives is clearly the fundamental one, being aligned and being closer to the ultimate beneficiaries, and secondly, seeing disclosure not as a burden, but actually a driver of improved management of those pension funds.
Thank you. I have a last question. Considering the other country studies that you've already conducted with China and Brazil and the other countries in Europe, what are the main lessons learned for the Italian financial system that you think that should be, included into the Italian national dialogue on sustainable finance, where FIM is participating as well? So, what do you think are the lessons learned?
Well, no, and it was great to host one of the meetings at your offices in Milan recently. So I think there are a number of things. Maybe the first is recognizing that this question of sustainable finance and green finance, I think in many countries, and I think also in Italy, is now becoming part of wider sort of financial strategy. Clearly, in Europe, there's a major program to relaunch the economy, so-called Juncker plan, and to use public finance to mobilize private capital for long-term innovation, infrastructure, SME finance, and so on. And sustainability is really a core part of that. So I think that's the main thing, is no longer seeing this agenda perhaps as a niche, something for a CSR department, but really about the strategic direction, the next phase of development, and therefore how do we think about sustainable finance as being core to financial strategy. So I think that's a lesson from across Europe, but also I think it comes through in the work in India and also in China. I think the other area is recognizing within that actually each country is really very different. Each country has very different financial systems, even within the European Union, and therefore there isn't let's say a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. That international lessons can be learned, but really the strategies and the priorities that countries develop have to be really fit well with the particular structure of the financial system. The UK, very capital markets heavy, very global financial system. France, again, having different roles for state institutions, such as case or Germany again. So I think that's the other thing, that there's a good scope for international learning, but actually recognizing that to be effective, this has to be very much tailored to specific issues. And the third, I think, is again the point I've made through this discussion, is recognizing that the speed of the development and things such as thinking about green bonds and so on, that these can move from a situation of being completely peripheral in terms of international dialogue to being really quite an exciting theme. So again, I take the example of India, again, a very thin debt capital market in terms of corporate issuance, and increasingly people seeing that actually the interest and excitement around the green bond arena will not only be good for green finance, raising capital for smart cities or metro systems or renewables, but also could help to pump prime the growth of debt capital markets as a whole in India. So I think that's the sort of third area. Recognize this is moving quite quickly, and no one has the answer, which is good, that actually that there is a great scope for experimentation, I'd say.
Great, thank you very much for this extensive answer and for the very clear presentation. So now I think we can finish. We can stop here. I would like to so thanking Nick. I would like to announce the next webinar that will be held next June 15, and will be given by Alexander Barkawi, the founder and director of the Council on Economic Policies. And this will be on the role of the banking sector and the monetary policy. So thank you.
I would really recommend that. Alex Barkawi is a very much an outstanding analyst in this area, and he's been one of our partners. So I'll listen into that myself as well. That's going to be great fun.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye to
Thanks,
all of you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.